In 2016, the world watched as the Colombian government and the FARC insurgency signed a landmark agreement. After more than 50 years of continuous fighting, the longest-running armed rebellion in the Americas was officially over. But back home, the reaction was bitterly divided. A massive portion of the public actually voted against the initial deal, splitting the country down the middle. To make sense of how a peace treaty could be so polarizing, you have to look at the mechanics of the fighting itself. The conflict functioned as a 60-year chain reaction of cause and effect, where every attempt to solve a crisis triggered a new, more complicated one. And to find the spark that set that chain off, we have to rewind decades before the drug cartels even existed. For the first half of the 20th century, state power swung violently between two factions: liberal reformers pushing for secular social changes, and conservative traditionalists allied with the church and regional elites. The tension between these two groups snapped in 1948. Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, a highly popular liberal presidential candidate, was gunned down in the middle of Bogotá. The assassination triggered massive riots that leveled parts of the capital, and the chaos quickly bled into the countryside. For the next 10 years, liberal and conservative militias fought a brutal, undeclared civil war known simply as La Violencia. By the time the fighting paused, nearly 300,000 citizens were dead. Realizing they were destroying the country they were trying to govern, the two parties struck a desperate truce. They formed the Frente Nacional, an agreement to strictly alternate the presidency and split all state jobs evenly for 16 years. The pact worked. The partisan killings stopped, but by legally guaranteeing that only traditional liberals and conservatives could hold office, the state completely shut out all alternative political voices. In vast, impoverished rural areas, where the government barely existed anyway, that forced exclusion created a dangerous power vacuum. Entire communities of peasant farmers found themselves completely disconnected from the democratic process, isolated by a system fiercely protecting the elite. Out of that isolation, new armed factions emerged in the mid-1960s. Groups like the FARC and ELN organized as peasant militias to fight back against the state. At this stage, they were ideological rebels. Influenced heavily by the Cold War and the Cuban Revolution, their stated goals were aggressive agrarian reform and seizing power for the working class. A localized peasant rebellion could have eventually been contained or negotiated down. The timeline, however, was about to violently collide with a massive new economic engine that would change the entire trajectory of the country forever. In the 70s and 80s, global demand for cocaine surged. Figures like Pablo Escobar and the cartels began generating immense illegal wealth. The guerrillas quickly realized that this booming black market overlapped directly with their remote territories. They started charging heavy taxes on the coca crops grown in their areas, extracting massive profits. Flush with cash, they scaled up their operations. To maintain their growing armies, they diversified their criminal portfolio, launching campaigns of extortion and civilian kidnapping across the country. The influx of narco-dollars stripped away the insurgency's ideological purity, evolving them into a self-financing enterprise capable of sustaining a perpetual war. As guerrillas grew wealthier, rural landowners and business elites found themselves entirely exposed. The National Army was stretched too thin to stop the kidnappings. Frustrated by the lack of state protection, elites funded private security. These militias quickly grew into the heavily equipped paramilitary armies of the AUC. Under the banner of hunting down insurgents, the paramilitaries launched a ruthless counteroffensive. They displaced entire communities, targeting any civilians suspected of sympathizing with the left-wing rebels. The paramilitaries soon realized the fastest way to buy weapons was through drugs. They deeply integrated themselves into the trafficking routes, becoming drug lords. By the 1990s, Colombia entered the era of total war. A chaotic four-way struggle pulled the country in every direction. The state army, guerrillas, paramilitaries, and cartels were all shooting at each other, fighting for control of the same drug money. The private attempt to fix the guerrilla problem had simply spawned a new, equally brutal actor. The country was trapped in a cycle of retaliatory violence, completely bankrolled by the drug trade. During the 2000s, the state finally escalated its response. Under the administration of Álvaro Uribe, the military launched aggressive offensives that severely battered the FARC's ranks and pushed the paramilitary groups into a controversial demobilization process. That intense military pressure is what ultimately forced the FARC to the negotiating table. Years later, under President Juan Manuel Santos, thousands of rebel fighters finally handed over their weapons in the historic 2016 disarmament. Yet the structural problems remained. Dissident guerrilla factions refused the peace terms and kept their rifles. And because the demand for cocaine never dropped, the black market money was still there, waiting for new illegal groups to claim the abandoned territory. The daily combat stats plummeted rapidly, saving thousands of lives. But the sheer length of the conflict and the millions of victims caught in the crossfire left society deeply traumatized and entirely divided over who was actually responsible for the disaster. Today, the old liberal and conservative battle lines are largely gone. The country is now fractured by two competed historical memories of the war itself. The progressive narrative argues extreme inequality and exclusion forced peasants to arms, meaning peace requires profound social reform. On the other side, the conservative view argues insurgents were criminals who caused immense suffering, meaning peace requires strict security and institutional order. You see these two interpretations clashing in the streets constantly. Every protest and political rally is shadowed by accusations of who belongs to the guerrillas and who supports the paramilitaries. Colombia managed to survive a 60-year chain reaction of violence, but securing its future requires more than silencing the remaining guns. The country has to figure out how to reconcile two completely different realities of what just happened.